Hi everybody, I'm Dr. Larry Malerba. Welcome back to the ATH Materia Medica series. Today's remedy is Hepar sulphurous calcareum. Dr. Hahnemann made Hepar Sulph by burning oyster shell with flowers of sulfur, which is a fine yellow powder ground from sulfur. Also known as calcium sulfide, Hepar Sulph contains both calcium and sulfur, which is why it has a number of similarities to the remedies calcarb, sulfur, and calc sulph. All right, let's talk about Hepar Sulph.
Now, if there's a theme that runs throughout Hepar's symptomatology, it goes something like this. There's an extreme hypersensitivity and susceptibility to all external influences, mental, emotional, and physical, which creates a feeling of vulnerability and insecurity, which in turn leads to defensive reactions and violent irritability. So a simple example of this progression would be a person who falls and scrapes his shin. At first it appears to be no big deal, but then it quickly becomes infected and bubbles up into a very sensitive boil-like eruption. He rolls up his pant leg because it's very painful to any kind of touch or contact. Family members try to examine it, but he defensively and angrily warns them not to touch it or even go near it. So as you can see, susceptibility and sensitivity lead to insecurity and vulnerability, which then causes defensiveness and reactivity. All right, let's take a closer look at this pattern, beginning with the Hepar Sulph mental state. So the great sensitivity of Hepar Sulph applies to the mental level as well as to the physical level, regardless of whether there's a painful ailment or condition involved. The Hepar type is highly sensitive to anything that poses a threat, and he is sensitive to emotional pain as well as physical pain. It's as if Hepar has no barriers to outside forces or influences. He can be easily disturbed by noise, touch, odors, and/or light, and he's particularly bothered by cold, especially cold drafts of air. He's hypersensitive to all kinds of stimuli. He's hypersensitive to suffering in general, and can even be sensitive to the suffering of others. Now, some sources refer to Hepar as being oversensitive. Call me oversensitive, but I take issue with this term. It implies that a person is more sensitive than he or she should be, as if to say that they should be able to have better control over how they react to things. But as is the case with any symptom, Hepar can't just decide to be less sensitive. After all, a symptom is something that is beyond our control. So I prefer the term hypersensitive. We don't chastise someone for being hypertensive or hyperthyroid. Neither should we question the courage of a person who is hypersensitive. In the case of Hepar Sulph, hypersensitivity is a symptomatic state beyond their control. Now, it's easy to see how this kind of amped up sensitivity could make a person feel rather vulnerable. Hepar can feel vulnerable to potential threats on any level, mental, emotional, or physical. For example, he may feel offended or insulted easily, even when there is no offense intended. He may think that those upon whom he depends treat him badly. Hepar can feel neglected or unappreciated. This pervasive feeling of vulnerability can understandably cause Hepar to feel anxious and insecure. Sometimes his anxiety reaches the level of hypochondriasis. It makes sense that he would be anxious about the things that he is sensitive to, and as we shall see, given his extreme susceptibility to inflammatory and infectious illnesses, It also makes sense that Hepar would be anxious about becoming sick. This sense of vulnerability and insecurity can cause Hepar Sulph to seek circumstances that will ensure his security. He desires protection from the things that threaten his well-being. Protection may take the form of financial security or physical comforts. It also makes sense that such a state would eat away at one's self-esteem. Sometimes Hepar Sulph can lack self-confidence and in some cases may become self-destructive. Now, naturally, a person's insecurities and vulnerabilities tend to be reflected in their fears. The Hepar Sulph fears include the following: fear of accidents or being injured, fear of misfortune, fear of being alone, fear of death, fear of suffering, fear of touch, fear of bees, fear of bugs in general. Here we see the similarity to calc carb. Fear of snakes, fear of animals, fear of the dentist, fear for the health of relatives, and last but not least, fear of fire. We'll talk more about Hepar's relationship to fire in the next section. Suffice it to say that Hepar tends to have a wide variety of fears and insecurities. Okay, now, so as a consequence of Hepar Sulph's hypersensitivity and feelings of insecurity, there's a tendency to react defensively. And these defensive reactions can be either physical or emotional or both. It's easy to imagine how someone with a painful abscess, for example, might recoil violently if the abscess was touched or prodded. Hepar tends to react angrily when he feels threatened. And as a form of self-defense, he may counterpunch, so to speak, with aggressive language or violent actions. When Hepar feels threatened or exposed, he may respond by making threats. Think of it as a type of uncontrollable defensive volatility. Hepar can be extremely irritable and may make furious gestures. He has a hair-trigger temper and can fly suddenly into a rage. He is very touchy and quarrelsome and may become violent from the slightest disturbance. Hepar Sulph lists in repertories under anger about trifles, beside oneself about trifles, irritability about trifles, ailments from trifles, and violence from trifles. These rubrics illustrate how even minor irritants, aka trifles, can provoke strong reactions from the Hepar type. Generally speaking, on a day-to-day basis, Hepar types tend to be critical, impatient, fretful, and discontented. Hepar can also be ambitious and dictatorial. He's often very hurried and can speak hastily and eat and drink hastily. Another way to conceptualize Hepar is to think of someone with a fiery temperament. He is intense and reactive, and when that inner fire flares up, he's just like an exquisitely painful, inflamed boil ready to burst. This is when the irritability caused by his own state of pain and suffering, whether physical or emotional, can quickly spill over into physical aggression. He may become abusive, malicious, and cruel. In such moments, he may be gripped by an impulse to lash out violently. Hepar lists prominently under desire to kill from least contradiction, desire to kill the person who offended him, desire to kill one's own child, sudden impulse to kill for a slight offense, and threatens to kill. Now, these violent impulses are usually directed at others, but sometimes they're directed at himself. So the Hepar impulse to violence can be either homicidal or suicidal. And a tool of violence commonly used is a knife. And as we'll see, this method of mayhem reflects the nature of his own symptoms, which tend to be sudden, sharp, penetrating, and violent. Hepar lists prominently under desire to kill with a knife and suicidal disposition with a knife. However, the weapon of destruction most often employed by the Hepar Sulph type is fire. There appears to be a very strong relationship between Hepar and fire. Recall that Hepar is made by burning oyster shell with sulfur. I've successfully treated a good number of adolescents with behavior problems, in addition to kids who develop frequent infections with Hepar, especially after finding out that they have a fascination with fire. When a parent reveals that they caught their kid playing with matches on more than one occasion, I immediately think of Hepar. Sometimes they're a little too preoccupied with tending to the fire in the fireplace or at the family campground. As adults, these individuals may be drawn to fire as a profession. Firefighters who commit arson are not uncommon. In fact, it's a well-documented phenomenon. It's estimated that approximately 100 firefighters in the U.S. are arrested on suspicion of arson annually. Sadly, the world is unaware of the fact that Hepar Sulph could be the #1 solution for pyromania. The following repertory rubrics illustrate this strong connection between Hepar Sulph and fire. Wants to set the house on fire. Throws things into the fire. Sudden impulse to throw the child into the fire. Suicidal disposition to set oneself on fire. Delusions of fire. Delusion the house is on fire. Delusion that the world is on fire. Dreams of fire. And on the flip side, sometimes we see fear of fire, fear that things will catch fire, and lastly, burning pains like fire. So again, we see how the potentially destructive nature of fire mirrors the fiery, inflammatory, and aggressive quality of Hepar Sulph's symptoms and behaviors. Okay, now let's move on to the generals and modalities. Okay, now, so one of the more clear-cut characteristics of the Hepar type is that they are very chilly. Hepar is one of the coldest of all the remedies. Hepar is very sensitive to and aggravated by all forms of cold. I sometimes hesitate to prescribe Hepar for an acute ailment if the person does not complain of feeling cold or does not have some symptom that is aggravated by cold. Hepar is worse from cold air, worse from cold drafts of air, worse from cold bathing, worse from uncovering even a single part, and worse from cold applications. Hepar can be bothered by all forms of cold weather, but especially cold, dry winds. It's one of the main remedies listed under ailments from cold, dry wind. Exposure to cold, dry wind can precipitate things like colds, coughs, asthma, and croup. Hepar tends to be worse in dry conditions and better during damp weather. On the flip side, Hepar is better from warmth, and he's better from wrapping up, especially wrapping up the head or wearing a hat. Hepar perspires easily, like calcarb. Sometimes the perspiration ameliorates, and sometimes it does not. Additional modalities include an aggravation from touch, and sometimes symptoms are worse at night. Now, in terms of general food interests, Hepar has a strong liking for sour things. Hepar desires sour or acidic foods and drinks. The main craving is for vinegar. Hepar is the #1 remedy listed for desires vinegar. There can also be a desire for pickles. Additional preferences include wine and spicy foods. And there can be a desire for or aversion to fatty or rich foods. As would be expected, Hepar can be aggravated by cold food and drinks and ameliorated by warm drinks. All right, now let's talk about Hepar's physical symptomatology. Okay, now, generally speaking, Hepar's physical pathology tends to fall into two main categories. It's prone to developing a wide variety of respiratory conditions, and it also fits infections on a more localized level, usually in the form of abscesses and skin infections. Broadly speaking, all of these illnesses tend to exhibit two main characteristics. They are often very painful, and they are very sensitive to all forms of cold. Hepar Sulph's tremendous sensitivity renders it highly susceptible to sickness and infection. It's a remedy type that easily catches cold. And those colds tend to linger and progress, for example, into cases of sinusitis or bronchitis. You name an itis, and Hepar Sulph is always on the list of potential indicated remedies. Whether it's a case of otitis, laryngitis, pharyngitis, tonsillitis, conjunctivitis, blepharitis, mastitis, or prostatitis, we always consider Hepar, especially when there's a great pain and chilliness involved. Take otitis media, for example. Children's ear infections that require Hepar tend to be extremely painful. The ear is so painful that it does not tolerate being touched. The child is usually chilly, and the ear pain is made worse by exposure to any cold. Even the slightest draft of air can aggravate the pain. Sometimes the infection localizes into an abscess, which can then suppurate until it discharges pus. The challenge often becomes how to keep the ear warm while simultaneously not touching it. Hepar is also a remedy for asthma, pneumonia, croupy coughs, and coughs in general. It fits loose coughs, choking coughs, and hoarse coughs. In all cases, the cough is aggravated by cold in general, including cold air, cold drafts of air, and cold winds. Now, Hepar Sulph also has a distinct tendency towards suppuration, or pus formation. Hepar infections tend to suppurate rapidly, producing thick, yellow, cheesy, sour discharges. This often happens in the case of abscesses, which tend to be extremely painful and sensitive to both touch and cold. Hepar fits dental abscesses, abscesses of the tonsils, abscesses under the arms, rectal abscesses, and cases of mastitis that abscess. Given Hepar's susceptibility to infection, even minor skin wounds can begin to suppurate. We also think of Hepar when swollen glands threaten to suppurate. This can occur with salivary glands, the parotid gland, and lymphatic glands. All of Hepar's discharges tend to be cheesy, sour, and offensive smelling. In addition to the pus produced by abscesses, this can also apply to perspiration, stool, diarrhea, leukorrhea, ear discharges, and nasal discharges. Between Hepar's sour discharges, sour temperament, and craving for sour foods, it makes sense to think of sourness as another defining feature of Hepar in general. Now, the pains associated with all of Hepar's ailments tend to be sharp and intense. Hepar pains are often described as sharp, stabbing, stitching, splinter-like pains. In otitis, there may be sharp pains in the ear. In tonsillitis, there can be splinter-like pains in the throat that extend to the ear when swallowing. In fact, if the pain associated with a particular condition is only mild and not particularly intense, I will sometimes hesitate to prescribe Hepar. Additional skin conditions that may respond to Hepar include boils and painful cases of acne. We can think of both as smaller versions of abscesses. Hepar is the main remedy for boils under the arms, which, given their location, can be extremely painful. Hepar also fits painful cracks and ulcers of the skin or mucosa with sharp burning pains. There may be cracks on the lips, hands, or feet. We also think of Hepar when there are chills before or during hives. It fits asthma from suppressed eruptions. And lastly, it is a remedy for paronychia, which is an inflammation of the fingertips, especially around the nails. All right, now let's summarize Hepar Sulph by listing some of its main features. We have hypersensitivity, vulnerability, insecurity, defensiveness, reactivity, irritability, anger, susceptibility, inflammation, infection, suppuration, violence, fire, sourness, and great pain and chilliness. Okay, let's talk about remedy relationships. Okay, so remedies considered to be complements to Hepar are aconite, spongia, calendula, and silica. Remedies worth comparing to Hepar include calc carb and sulfur. Sometimes we have cases that resemble one of these two remedies, but there may be some clue or symptom that doesn't quite add up. Maybe the person is extremely chilly or very irritable or has a craving for vinegar. In such cases, we must consider Hepar Sulph. Calc sulph is a croup remedy, likes sour things, fits abscesses and boils, but is definitely more warm-blooded. Chamomilla is also very irritable and extremely pain-sensitive, but it is not nearly as chilly or cold-sensitive. Mercurius develops infections easily, has foul-smelling discharges, can be sensitive to cold, and fits ulcers and abscesses. Silica likewise catches cold easily, is susceptible to infection, is chilly in general, and develops abscesses that tend to suppurate more slowly over time. Sorinum is very chilly, anxious, catches cold easily, and is prone to a variety of skin conditions. Nux vomica is also very chilly, can be irritable and violent, and can have a sudden impulse to kill with a knife. Lachesis is defensive, aggressive, and gets boils and abscesses that can suppurate. Nitric acid is chilly, anxious, and irritable, has sharp splinter-like pains, and fits ulcers and abscesses with offensive discharges. Phosphorus, lacks boundaries to outside forces, is prone to respiratory infections, but desires cold food and drinks. And finally, sepia is irritable, can be chilly, and loves vinegary things. All right, there you have it. That's Hepar Sulph in a nutshell. Thanks for watching. Please be sure to subscribe, and that will allow you to tune in again to the next All Things Homeopathy episode. May the vital force be with you.